Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Law Academy podcast. This is episode 3, and the aim wasn't to be doing a podcast today. The aim wasn't to be doing as many as we do. The aim was to be doing these once a week and to be talking about specific and interesting legal issues that relate to all over the world and all different topics. But I'm afraid that we have to talk about the developments that have been taking place in Russia and Ukraine, and ultimately the invasion that took place in the early hours of today. I'm recording this at 12:15 in the afternoon on the 24th of February 2022. So anything that I say in this might be completely out of date by the time it even comes out, but we will keep on continuing to move. And the aim isn't to talk about the news itself necessarily, because we all know what's going on. If you're not living under a rock, you know what's going on. The aim is to talk about some of the international law aspects of this, some of the international humanitarian law aspects of this, and actually also some of the international criminal law aspects of this as well. And also to talk about the proposed economic sanctions that have been placed and will be placed on Russia and the consequences of them. So let's just briefly recap about what happened this time last week when I was recording the first episode of this, talking about the build-up of hostilities. And ultimately, this was beginning when we're talking about Russia, Ukraine, and international law. We talked about the history of this the conflict in this region. We talked about the fact that in the 1990s we see the independence of Ukraine, and we see in 2014 the annexation of Crimea. We also talked very briefly about the concept of the international law on the use of force. So we talked about the fact that we can boil down international law on the use of military force or use of armed force into a series of fundamental principles. And these principles include Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. Now, this is really where we're going to start. If we're talking about the international law on the use of force, we begin by talking about Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. And it states that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. This is what Article 2.4 states. And you can see that even as early as last week, you could make the claim that Russia had been infringing on this particular article, because it doesn't just mention the fact that we have to refrain from any kind of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, but they also make clear that it is also the threat or use of force. Now, arguably, the Russian Federation, has been threatening use of force ever since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So we can see that, and the events in the early hours of today, of this morning, were and have been a gross violation of the UN Charter, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. And so therefore, we have to rely on some of the potential exemptions to Article 2.4. Obviously, the first of these being authorization from the UN Security Council. That's Article 42 of the UN Charter. And then Article 51 of the UN Charter outlines the idea of self-defense. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later on about the concept of these independent states that have been declared by the Russian Federation, and this being the sort of umbrella by which an invasion has been allowed to take place, or at least has been justified by the Russian Federation, by Putin. So that's where we were in the last episode, and ultimately, what we're going to do now is talk about the events that have taken place since then, since last Friday, and then talk about what's going on now, very currently, the international community's response to this conflict that's taking place, a discussion about the different kind of economic sanctions that have been taking place and will continue to take place, and the consequences of them. I want to talk a little bit also about the concept of the aspect relating to international humanitarian law, and also the problems and potential threat, or at least potential commitment of war crimes that have taken place as early as effectively now, and then talk about the future. So the events so far, we've seen a huge build-up of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border. Russia has long resisted Ukraine's move towards European institutions like NATO and the European Union. We know this to be the case. And also, ultimately, the events that have unfolded since February begin on Monday, which was the 21st of February, 2022. And Putin had a very boring and very pointless speech where he rambled on about a lot of random shit, basically, and this talking a lot about the Soviet Union, talking a lot about Stalin, talking a lot about Lenin and Leninist principles, and then also referring to the fact that ultimately Ukraine should not exist in international law, according to Putin. And this is a long-established principle, a long-established view that he's had, that he does not recognise or hasn't recognised Ukraine as an independent state. And ultimately, in this speech, and as a result of this speech, the Russian Federation declared the independence of two new states in the Donbass region in Ukraine. Now, the Donbass region in Ukraine has been a region of the world that has been subject to tensions and conflict and civil for a very long time, because we have seen Russian separatist movements take place, and ultimately independence movements away from Ukraine in that region. And the unilateral declaration of independence of two new states in the Donbass region ultimately served as a justification for armed conflict, because this declaration of independence was used as a justification for Russian involvement in this region, and they ultimately began to launch a series of quote-unquote peacekeeping forces into this region. Ultimately, the word peacekeeping is simply just a front for an aggressive act against the recognised area of Ukraine. And ultimately, the Declaration of Independence, declaring these states as independent states, has been just a justification for an invasion. That's ultimately what it is. You can't expect it to be anything else, effectively. As a result, we see some economic sanctions being placed. President Biden spoke the day after, I believe, on the Wednesday, or on the Tuesday, and issued a number of economic sanctions. We'll talk about these sanctions in a minute. And then things remain tense. They remain tense until the early hours of the Thursday, the 24th of February, today. Shortly before this period, at midnight, Ukraine issued a state of emergency across the country, lasting 30 days, and Russia launched a full-scale invasion a few hours later, when they attacked Ukraine in the early hours of this morning. It's very difficult to get any kind of accurate information out of this conflict so far, because it has been there's a lot of misinformation out there already, but we do know that there have been airstrikes around at least 8 Ukrainian cities, and ultimately the more we will know will take place as this conflict develops and takes shape, and as we see a few more developments later on today and tomorrow. So we don't know enough now about what's going on ultimately at the moment, but there are a few points that we need to raise, that we need to make clear from the previous episode. So the previous episode, we talked about the concept of this being an act of aggression. Now, this invasion of Ukraine is without a doubt an act of aggression and a violation of both international law under the UN Charter, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, as well as international criminal law, Article 8 of the Rome Statute. This is an illegal act of war. This is an illegal use of force, and it would be an illegal and therefore considered an international crime, an act of aggression. We did talk in the last episode that even though this is actually an act of aggression, the International Criminal Court couldn't actually try Vladimir Putin at The Hague for this act, considering that Russia is not a member of the Rome Statute, and so therefore the ICC has no jurisdiction. But we did say that when it comes to the concept of war crimes and the concept of violations of international humanitarian law, there is the potential for the ICC to have jurisdiction, because Ukraine has at least offered jurisdiction to the ICC, and so therefore there is the jurisdiction by that method. Now, it is too early to come to any conclusions yet, but there have been rumours and claims of potential war crimes being committed during this conflict. Now, there have already been claims made relating to the use of white phosphorus, which is a chemical that ultimately burns when it reacts with the air, and it causes fatal chemical burns, and is a very, very gruesome method of killing. Now, if these claims are true, then this would be a war crime. Claim as simple as that. This would be a war crime. And ultimately, when we're talking about the principles of international humanitarian law, there are a number of different things that we can, avenues that we can target and we can look at and pinpoint when we're talking about the potential for war crimes being committed. So, for instance, when it comes to targeting decisions made by the Russian Federation, the military, the Russian Federation, if these military targeting decisions are not in line with the principles of international humanitarian law, then these are war crimes. So the first of these being the principle of distinction. The Russian military will have to, in any scenario, be able to and actively make a distinction between combatant and non-combatant targets when they are making targeting decisions and launching attacks. This is something that we don't know yet about what's going on. We'll know more as time progresses. This is the first of the principles of distinction of targeting. The next is the principle of precaution. So, where an attack is going to take place and where an attack is deemed necessary by the Russian military, again, this is also a principle of international humanitarian law. There has to be a certain amount of necessity in targeting. And if there are civilians involved, or at least in the region of these targets, there has to be a certain amount of precaution taken place. They have to forewarn the civilians, the non-combatants, that an attack is going to take place. If not, again, this would be a war crime. And there are other principles of international humanitarian law that need to be followed, that ought to be followed, and ultimately, all of these principles of IHL that are to be adhered to, again, like I've said, we would not know, and we cannot know about whether or not war crimes have been committed just as of yet, because we don't know anything about what's going on. And so therefore, we have to let time develop and time pass to eventually come to any kind of conclusions. But there have been multiple claims made of the use of white phosphorus so far, which would clearly be a violation of international humanitarian law. Now, the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, has made calls to adhere to the basic principles of IHL. Whether or not this is the case is something, again, we will need to work out as time progresses. Now, the international community has, of course, condemned the actions by Russia and will be imposing economic sanctions. There have already been economic sanctions imposed on Russia by the US, namely the United States, but there is more that we can talk about, and we will talk about a little bit later on. As of 11:34 today, the NATO chief has condemned the attack as a deliberate cold-blooded attack and stated that this is a grave moment for security in Europe. Now, when it comes to economic sanctions, they are definitely on there, but it's a slightly controversial issue. So, for example, the European Union, in their package of economic sanctions, only signed off the first tranche of economic sanctions as of late yesterday afternoon. And since the full-scale invasion, they have announced that there will be a second round of economic sanctions to reflect this ramping up of aggression within the region. However, EU member states are not united on the direction of sanctions. So according to reports, Germany and Italy are named by diplomats as being quote-unquote jumpy about the adopting of the heaviest of sanctions and economic measures. The problem that we have in Europe is that this is a difficult issue, because if the economic sanctions are way too harsh, or at least ultimately they should be as harsh as possible, because this is an act of an illegal aggression. But if the economic sanctions are too harsh, this could have a negative impact on the European economy. Ultimately, it could have a negative impact on the European Union because of the general integration between all of these states in Europe. Obviously, they're not as integrated as the EU single market is, but there is a certain amount of integration in this region. And so therefore, they have to tread carefully when it comes to the economic sanctions that are being placed. And the problem is, if there is no united front in regards to EU member states as to the direction of economic sanctions, this could pose as a sign of weakness to the Russian Federation. Now, in regard to members in Europe that are not members of the European Union, namely the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has addressed this issue as a, quote, catastrophe for our continent, and will address Parliament later today, has already addressed the nation as a few minutes ago, and stated a number of things. He has said that there will be further military aid granted to the region in Ukraine, and also massive economic sanctions. Again, we don't know what these economic sanctions are going to be yet, but we know that these are going to be harsh economic sanctions. So, and we're also getting further military aid. Now, the question of whether or not there's even going to be a Ukrainian military to give this aid to by the time this aid arrives is a matter for that we're going to have to find out as time progresses. So, ultimately, I should make note as well that on a slightly side note, potentially humorous side note. I know this is not a humorous issue, but on a side note, the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, blames this invasion on a, quote, rigged election, claiming that if he had won the election and if Sleepy Joe was not president of the United States, this wouldn't have happened. So just as a little side note, that the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, has made his position on this very clear, and it's a position that I'm sure we are all value very, very highly. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the economic sanctions specifically. Now, what are these economic sanctions so far, and how do they affect the Russian Federation? Well, the West have all announced tranches of economic sanctions against Russia, and we know this, and effectively Biden on Tuesday has already announced the beginning of sanctions to be imposed on Russia. And the important thing that the Biden administration said, which I think is probably the most important thing, was that these sanctions were imposed in relation to and as a result of their the increase in tensions in Russia. So what I mean by this is they were going to reflect the escalation of tensions by the Russian Federation. So the sanctions that were issued on Tuesday were what we would describe as relatively lax or relatively weak sanctions, because they reflected the tensions at that time, and they said that if tensions were to increase, they will increase sanctions, etc., etc. So, and as such, we have a quote here from Biden saying that as Russia contemplates its next move, we have our next move prepared as well. So, the US sanctions were defined by the Council on Foreign Relations, and they included the withdrawal of customary trade and financial relations for foreign security policy purposes. And ultimately, the economic sanctions that were issued on Tuesday were targeted at specific individuals, or specific Russian institutions. The first being the Bank for Development and Foreign Economic Affairs, or quote, abbreviated to the VEB, and also a public joint stock company, the PSB, in Russia as well. Now, you might think that this tranche of sanctions is not particularly meaningful or significant in any way, but it's important to note that these two economic institutions, financial institutions, are quite significant within the Russian Federation. So the VEB has an asset portfolio of over $53 billion and is therefore one of Russia's top 5 financial institutions. More importantly, the PSB, the second of these, the Public Joint Stock Company, is Russia's 8th largest bank and designated financial aid for the Russian military and defense and also broader defense sectors. Importantly, this 8th largest bank actually services nearly 70% of Russia's defense contracts. So we can see that the financial and economic sanctions that are being imposed by the United States, and hopefully by the rest of the world, and specifically also the European Union as well, are trying to target specific institutions and specific areas of the Russian Federation, and namely the Russian defense contracts, 70% of Russian defense contracts. And if this takes place, then this can have a negative impact on the Russian defense system. Now, again, these sanctions were not the most of severe, but again, what is going to be coming down the pipe in the next few hours as Biden addresses the nation at noon, I believe Eastern Standard Time, they will increase. Okay. On top of sanctioning these institutions, they also sanctioned 17 of the public joint stock companies' subsidiaries. So we're really attacking this defense sector as much as possible. Now, one of the problems with economic sanctions, one of the problems that we have with the introduction of these economic sanctions is it has been made clear, or there have been claims made, that Putin may regard some of the most severe sanctions as declarations of war. Now, this is a potential escalation issue, because it could end up implicating NATO eventually, ultimately anyway. So what we mean by this is there have been claims, or at least it has been alleged, that Putin would regard, for example, the Western countries like the European Union and the United States, if they were to freeze the Russian Federation out of the international banking sector, this could be seen as a declaration of war on the part of the Russian Federation. So ultimately, there is a big issue here, because whether or not sanctions will work is a question that we're going to ask in a second. But if the sanctions are too harsh and they are viewed by the Russian Federation and by Vladimir Putin as a declaration of war, then this could implicate NATO into this conflict and could ultimately lead to European conflict in Europe. So now, this isn't me trying to be quite hyperbolic in this case. I don't think anyone seriously believes that this is a hyperbole to suggest that that we are often teetering on the edge when it comes to the war in Europe in this regard. There already is a conflict in Europe, but whether or not NATO gets involved in this conflict is something that might ultimately be out of their hands if Putin views any of these economic sanctions as potential declarations of war, or if they decide to implicate other NATO members that are along the border as potential targets as well. So again, the aim of the sanctions are clear. The severity of the sanctions reflect the severity of Russia's actions, and we know from last night that Russia's actions are incredibly severe. But one of the questions we have to ask is, will they work? We've already talked about this issue of Putin regarding some of these sanctions as declarations of war. Now, if that is the case, then that might mean that the Western states withhold some of the most severe of sanctions because they don't want to lead to a situation where we have a war against NATO. But even if that isn't the case, even if we can impose the most severe sanctions on the Russian Federation without potentially broadening and escalating the conflict further, will the sanctions work? And this is a problem that we have to ask, because one of the a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies has stated that the Russian economy has worked to quote unquote sanction-proof itself since 2014. So in 2014, for those who don't remember, we have the illegal annexation of Crimea. And in response to this illegal annexation of Crimea, the Western states, the European Union, the United Kingdom, which was part of the EU at the time, and the United States, issued quite strong economic sanctions against the Russian Federation. And apparently since then, it has been said that they have quote-unquote sanction-proofed the Russian against any further potential sanctions that could take place. So there really is the problem of whether or not these sanctions will even work in the first place. We know that the Russian Federation has quite strong financial reserves. As well as this, if we think about just the psychology of the dictator of the Russian Federation, if this is the case, Putin knew about the threats of these sanctions for years, and at least in the last few months has known that packages of sanctions will be imposed if they attack the Ukraine. So why did they do that anyway? They still made the conscious decision to invade Ukraine. So we have the potential that these economic sanctions won't work, and this could potentially take the sting out of any actions that are committed by the Western states, by the European Union, and by the United States. One of the things that relates to international law we should talk about before we finish is the concept of these independent states that are declared by the Russian Federation. So, as a justification for invasion, the Russian Federation, namely Vladimir Putin, decided to declare two new independent states in the Donbass region of Ukraine. Now, these have been regions that have been increasingly receiving Russian funding and Russian military supplies, and ultimately subject to a kind of sphere of influence for many, many years. Now, obviously, these are not recognized as independent states under international law. International law is a little bit more complicated when it comes to the recognition of states. A state cannot simply decide unilaterally that a part of a different country is going to be its own independent country. There is a requirement, and there are a number of different ways in which states gain recognition. Ultimately, within the view of international law, we have what were known as the Montevideo Convention, the Montevideo Convention on the Recognition of States. There are a number of different criteria, but ultimately, states will eventually get recognition if they are recognized by the United Nations. And this is something that doesn't happen very often. We could have a situation where you have a sort of de facto recognition of statehood by the United Nations. So, for example, Taiwan is a state that technically, at least in law, at least on paper, is part of China, but in all but name is its own independent state. It has its own embassies, it has its own military, I believe, and effectively it's its own island off the island of China. Off the state of China. So states like that could have de facto recognition in international law, but these two countries that have been established according to the Russian Federation are not, and probably will never be, recognized as independent states under international law, especially under this climate. If this was a different climate where they had recognized their own independence separately, and there was at least some more justification for there to be a recognition of independence, then this might be slightly different, and it might have been a slightly different situation. But since the Russian Federation is only recognizing these states as a justification for invasion, this is obviously never going to fly with the United Nations. The final thing I want to talk about is Putin's actual reasons for the invasion of Ukraine. Now, there have been reported airstrikes near 8 major cities and fighting on 3 major fronts. One of those major fronts including through the state of Belarus, so we can see that Belarus are allies to Russia in this regard, at least at the moment. And Putin has argued that this invasion is aimed at the demilitarization and denazification of the state of Ukraine. Again, this is just a propaganda ploy to try and justify an expansion of Russian imperialism into a different state. Into an independent democracy in the fact of Ukraine, by making accusations of Nazism and making the claim that they want to demilitarize this zone. Now, ultimately, we will have to see in the next few days or even in the next few hours what happens in regard to this conflict. It will continue to take shape, and when this video episode gets uploaded, there might be changing of the tides in terms of all the different things that are going on. But at the moment, we have seen a free fall in the stocks of some Russian companies. The ruble, the Russian currency, has also plummeted in terms of its value to pound sterling. It's now worth 0.008 pound sterling, and that is down from 0.008 0.93 as of 2 days ago, so we've seen a significant drop. You might not think that is significant, but it is a significant drop in recent days. And ultimately, we're going to have to see what happens, okay? So Russian markets will have to reel from this record low in terms of their currency exchange, and we're going to have to see what happens in relation to these economic sanctions. I'll keep everybody updated in terms of economic sanctions, and we will talk about them maybe in a separate lesson. A separate episode, sorry. I might do a talking about some news in the next podcast, because I want the next podcast episode not to be about Russia and Ukraine. I want it to be about something else. So we're going to talk about other things as well, like the effectiveness of the United Nations, the use of human rights within belligerent occupation scenarios and occupied territories. That might actually come in handy for Russian-Ukraine situation, actually, to be fair. But we'll talk about other areas of law. So this is really a sort of ad hoc lesson on, or at least an ad hoc episode on the Law Academy podcast. I hope everybody has enjoyed it and got some kind of useful information from it. I hope everybody's kept up to date on this unfolding of events and at least has a better understanding of the international law aspects of this conflict. And if there are any questions that anybody has, or any statements or anything that anybody wants to say, write them down in the comments below and we'll reply to everything and see where this conflict takes us. And I hope everybody has a great day.